Have you ever stumbled upon a story so intense and haunting that it feels like a movie playing out in real life? This is one of those stories, full of twists, secrets, and emotions that will keep you on the edge of your seat from start to finish. To respect the privacy of the people involved, I've changed their names and locations, but every heartbeat of this story is real. So sit back, listen closely, and follow along. And if you haven't subscribed yet, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the newest stories. Don't forget to like this video and leave a comment saying I'm listening so we can stay connected and journey through each story together. The rain had been falling since dawn, a thin mist drifting between the old maple trees that lined Evergreen Hills Cemetery. Sarah Thompson, 62, stood at the edge of the open grave, her black raincoat clinging to her shoulders, the hood pulled low over her damp gray hair. The sound of raindrops tapping against umbrellas mingled with the low murmur of a pastor's prayer. Richard Thompson, her husband of 40 years, lay in the polished oak coffin in front of her, a small brass plaque reading "Beloved Husband and Father," catching the dull light of the overcast sky. Sarah's hands trembled as she clutched a folded white handkerchief. Her eyes were red and swollen from nights of sleepless crying. Just a week earlier, Richard had supposedly perished in a warehouse fire on the outskirts of Ashland, a fire the authorities had called accidental. The words still rang hollow in her ears. Across the grave, their son Mark, 38, stood with his wife Emily under a large black umbrella. Mark's crisp navy suit looked out of place in the mud and drizzle. Emily, tall and slender in a beige trench coat, whispered something to him, and they both chuckled softly. It was a strange sound at a funeral, and Sarah felt her stomach tighten. She tried to focus on the pastor's words, but a creeping unease pressed against her chest. Then her handbag buzzed. The vibration was so sudden it startled her. She glanced down, an unknown Portland number. For a moment she hesitated. Who would call during Richard's burial? Her thumb slid across the screen. "Hello?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. A man's voice, urgent and low. "Mrs. Thompson, I can't tell you who I am yet, but Richard isn't dead." Sarah's knees nearly gave way. She stepped back, clutching the phone tighter. "What are you talking about?" she hissed, glancing around. "Listen to me," the voice said quickly. "Don't trust the people around you, especially Mark, your son." Her eyes shot toward Mark and Emily. They were looking at the coffin with solemn faces now, but to Sarah their expressions seemed rehearsed, like masks. She felt a cold shiver crawl up her spine. "Who are you?" she whispered into the phone, trying not to be noticed. "What do you know about my husband?" "I'll explain soon. But you're in danger. Watch what you say and to whom. I'll contact you again." The line went dead. Sarah lowered the phone slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. Rain dripped from her hood onto the screen. She turned her gaze back to Mark. He stood with his arm around Emily's shoulders, eyes fixed on the coffin. Yet Sarah swore she caught a flicker of something else, something sharp and calculating behind his grief. A lump rose in her throat. All at once, the world she had known, a devoted husband, a loyal son, tilted under her feet. She tightened her grip on the handkerchief until her knuckles went white, the whisper of the stranger echoing in her ears. "Richard isn't dead. Don't trust Mark." The soft drizzle over Evergreen Hills blurred Sarah's vision as she stood by Richard's coffin, and her mind drifted back more than 40 years. It was a hot July afternoon in 1980 at Lithia Park in Ashland, the kind of afternoon when the scent of pine needles mixed with the laughter of children splashing in the creek. Sarah was just 18 then, shy and slender, with sun-streaked hair tied back in a loose ponytail. She sat on a splintered wooden bench near the duck pond, a library book open on her lap, when a young man approached, carrying 2 glass bottles of cream soda. "Thought you might be thirsty," he said with a crooked, easy smile. Richard was 21, a junior staffer at the town library, his shirt sleeves rolled up to the elbows. He handed her the cold bottle. Condensation slid over her fingers. "Ashland may be small," he said, sitting beside her. "But our love can be big, don't you think?" Sarah remembered how her cheeks flushed at his boldness. "We've only been seeing each other 3 weeks, she teased, though her heart was already racing. "That's plenty of time to know," he replied, eyes crinkling. They spent the rest of that day strolling beneath the old oak trees, sharing plans and silly jokes. Richard pointed out the shape of the clouds, and she laughed when he compared one to a rocking chair. That was the first time she thought, I could build a life with this man. 2 years later, in 1982, they did. Their wedding was held in a modest white church on Siskiyou Boulevard. The reception smelled of homemade pies and fresh lilies. Friends tied tin cans to the back of Richard's battered Ford pickup, and the newlyweds drove away under a shower of rice, grinning like children. They settled into a little clapboard house at 417 Maple Avenue, its paint peeling, but its porch wide enough for 2 rocking chairs. Richard would later joke, "We'll fix it up a board at a time," like Noah's Ark. He opened Thompson's Woodcraft, a small woodworking shop on the edge of town, where the scent of cedar and sawdust clung to his flannel shirts. Sarah took a teaching job at Walker Elementary, where she taught second graders to read and paint watercolor sunsets. Through decades of Oregon rain and summer heat, they built a life brick by brick. She remembered winter evenings when the smell of Richard's fresh-cut timber mixed with her chicken pot pie. Remembered him coming home with sawdust in his hair, kissing her cheek before washing up. Their children came in due time. Mark, born 1986 with Richard's serious eyes, and Lily, born 1990, quick to giggle and cling to Sarah's skirt. They were a simple, hard-working family. No secrets, no schemes. At least that's what she had always believed. Standing now in the cemetery, Sarah's heart clenched with the ache of that memory. The rain on her face mingled with tears as she whispered toward the coffin. "Richard, why did you leave me?" Her voice cracked under the weight of years. Around her, mourners shifted quietly, unaware that in her mind she was not at a funeral but back in Lithia Park, sipping cream soda with a young man who promised her a life of love and honesty, promises she still wanted to believe. The smell of fresh-cut cedar was the first thing that greeted you when you stepped into the Thompsons' little world on Maple Avenue. Every morning at dawn, the steady hum of Richard's table saw drifted from the back of the property, mingling with the softer whir of Sarah's sewing machine in the kitchen. That was the soundtrack of Mark and Lily's childhood. Wood shavings on their father's boots, scraps of fabric on their mother's lap, and a home stitched together by 2 pairs of hard-working hands. On Saturdays, Richard would pile fishing rods and a dented cooler into the back of his pickup, calling out, "Mark, Lily, time to head to Emigrant Lake." Mark, with his dark hair always sticking up, would scramble to grab the tackle box, while Lily, a quiet girl with paint under her fingernails, clutched her sketchbook as if she might capture the lake on paper. Sarah stayed behind those mornings, humming as she kneaded pie dough in the small kitchen that always smelled of apples and cinnamon. She'd wave from the porch, apron dusted with flour, as the truck pulled away down Maple Avenue. "Don't let your father forget the life jackets," she'd shout, and Richard would grin, tapping his temple. "Never, sweetheart. Those were the days of small rituals. Homework at the kitchen table under Sarah's watchful eye, the smell of sawdust clinging to Richard's jacket as he leaned over to check Mark's math problems. Lily sketching quietly in the corner, humming the same tune her mother used while sewing. In winter, they crowded around the wood stove, mugs of cocoa warming their hands while Richard told stories about growing up in Oregon's logging towns. "Mom," Mark once announced between bites of pie, "when I grow up, I'm going to be an architect. I'll design houses bigger than this one, but just as warm." Sarah laughed, brushing crumbs from his cheek. "Build us a porch with 3 rocking chairs, okay?" "I want to paint murals on them," Lily chimed in, her eyes shining. Sarah would look at Richard then, their gazes meeting over the heads of their children, a silent understanding passing between them. "We've done well, but life has a way of stretching even the tightest seams." When Mark left for Portland at 18 to study business, Sarah baked him his favorite apple turnovers for the bus ride. "Call me when you get there," she said, pressing the warm pastry into his hand. He nodded but was already glancing at his phone. 2 years later, Lily boarded a train to Seattle with a portfolio of her artwork and a head full of dreams. The house on Maple Avenue grew quieter. The sewing machine's whir seemed louder without the children's chatter, the smell of fresh wood sharper. Sarah kept calling, sending care packages of cookies and handwritten notes. At first the replies came quickly, but gradually the calls grew shorter, the texts less frequent. Each time she held the phone to her ear, She imagined the sound of the lake, of pencils scratching on homework, of a boy and girl laughing in the kitchen. Sounds that now lived only in her memory. Standing at Richard's funeral years later, those memories pressed against her chest like a weight. She had believed, truly believed, she had raised good, kind children. In that rainy cemetery, she clung to that belief even as the stranger's warning echoed in her mind. It was the spring of 2018 when Mark returned to Ashland, but he was no longer the lanky boy with sawdust on his jeans. He stepped out of a gleaming black SUV in front of 417 Maple Avenue, wearing a charcoal gray suit that looked like it belonged on a magazine cover. His tie was perfectly knotted. His watch flashed silver in the afternoon sun. Sarah watched from the kitchen window, her hands still damp from rinsing vegetables, and felt an unfamiliar pang. This was her son, yes, but somehow also a stranger. Inside the living room, the scent of fresh-cut cedar still clung to Richard's shirt as he set down his hammer. He looked up at Mark with a mixture of pride and wariness. "You've done well for yourself, son," he said quietly, wiping his hands on a rag. Mark glanced around the small house, his expression flickering. "It's quaint," he said after a pause, then smiled the kind of smile people use in business meetings. "You know, Dad, that plot where your woodshop sits is getting hot. Developers are eyeing it. You could sell now and make a fortune." Richard chuckled, the sound low and rough. "This shop is my life's work, Mark. I built it board by board. It's not for sale." Emily stepped in then. Tall and elegant in a pale blue blouse, her heels clicking against the old hardwood floor. She laid a manicured hand on Mark's arm and spoke with a practiced sweetness. "We're only thinking of you, Dad. Portland has wonderful retirement homes. You'd have nurses, activities, everything. Isn't it time you both took it easy?" Sarah, standing near the kitchen doorway with a dish towel in her hand, felt the tension rise like steam. She forced a gentle tone. "We appreciate your concern, but your father and I will decide for ourselves. We're not ready for that kind of change." Mark's gaze flicked to her, sharp for an instant before softening again. "I'm just trying to help, Mom. Times are changing. You could live comfortably and travel, not be tied down to a dusty old shop." Richard's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice calm. "Some things aren't about money, son." Mark looked away, staring at a framed photo of himself as a boy holding a fish at Emigrant Lake. He gave a quick, almost impatient laugh. "Nostalgia doesn't pay the bills, Dad. Think about it." Sarah noticed then, the way Mark's eyes didn't linger on them, the way he seemed to measure the room as if calculating its worth. Emily's hand on his shoulder, the subtle nods between them. It wasn't just a visit. It was a presentation, a pitch. She pressed the dish towel to her chest to steady herself. Later that evening, after Mark and Emily had left, Richard stood in the doorway of the woodshop, looking at the rows of chisels and planers lined up like old friends. "He doesn't understand," he murmured. Sarah slipped her arm around his waist, feeling the weight of his disappointment. "He's changed," she said softly. And in her heart she couldn't shake the uneasy thought. Changed into what? By the time Lily turned 33, she had become a gentle but distant figure in Sarah's life. She taught art at a middle school in Seattle, her days filled with paint-stained aprons, shy students, and the smell of turpentine instead of sawdust. Each Christmas she sent handmade cards with watercolored snowflakes and a brief note. "Miss you, Mom. Busy with my students." But visits home were rare. When she did appear on Maple Avenue, it was as if she stepped back into a stage set from her childhood, unsure of her lines. Sarah remembered one particular visit in the fall of 2022. Lily arrived on the evening bus wearing a green wool coat and carrying a worn leather portfolio. She hugged her mother tightly on the porch, but her eyes drifted toward the workshop at the back of the property. Over dinner, Richard talked animatedly about a new rocking chair he was carving from Oregon maple. "You should come by tomorrow, Lil. It's the kind of piece you'd love to paint," he said, smiling hopefully. Lily twirled her fork in her mashed potatoes, hesitating. "Dad, the shop feels so different now. I don't know, She trailed off, then forced a smile. "Maybe I'll stop by before I leave." Sarah caught the flicker of unease in her daughter's face. the way she stiffened at questions about the woodshop or Mark's new ventures. It wasn't anger. It was something quieter, like guilt or caution. She reached across the table to squeeze Lily's hand. "It's still home, sweetheart. Nothing's changed." But things had changed. By the winter of 2023, Sarah felt as if only she and Richard were still tending the fragile flame of their family. The house was quiet most nights, the woodshop light glowing like a lone beacon at the edge of the yard. She often found Richard bent over his workbench late, his shoulders stooped, muttering to himself about bills and blueprints. Then, one gray afternoon in February, Mark arrived without warning. He swept into the kitchen in a tailored overcoat, laptop bag slung over his shoulder, his tone brisk. "Dad, we need to sign these papers. It's just a valuation of the house. Makes financial planning easier." Richard looked up from his mug of coffee, his face lined with sawdust and weariness. "A valuation? For what?" Mark tapped the folder with a manicured finger. "For flexibility. If you ever decide to sell or refinance, this locks in your equity." Sarah dried her hands on a towel, sensing the tension tighten like a wire. "Mark, maybe we can discuss this at dinner." "No," Richard snapped, standing abruptly. "I'm not signing anything. This is my home, my shop. I won't have it sliced up on paper for someone's plan." The silence after his words was heavy. Mark's jaw tightened. He slipped the folder back into his bag without another word, but his eyes were hard, calculating. He kissed his mother on the cheek mechanically, then left the house with quick, clipped steps. Sarah stood in the doorway watching his car disappear down Maple Avenue, the winter wind lifting her hair. For the first time, she realized the distance between her children wasn't just miles on a map. It had become a chasm, a cold, unspoken gulf that no apple pie or phone call could bridge. She shivered, pulling her cardigan tighter, and glanced at Richard. His hands were trembling slightly as he reached for his coffee. "Sarah," he murmured, "they're not our kids anymore." "Not really," she had no answer. Only the sound of the woodshop door swinging shut in the wind, like an echo of a life slipping away. June 10th, 2024 began like any other quiet morning on Maple Avenue. But before dawn, Sarah woke to the smell of smoke drifting faintly through her open bedroom window. At first she thought she was dreaming, the kind of dream where someone calls your name but you can't move. Then the phone rang, slicing through the dark. Her hands trembled as she grabbed it from the nightstand. "Mrs. Thompson?" a male voice said, urgent but clipped. "This is Officer Graham with the Ashland Police Department. There's been a fire at Thompson's Woodcraft. We believe your husband is inside." Sarah sat up, heart pounding. "Inside? No, he leaves at 6, not..." She didn't finish. She was already pulling on her coat, fumbling for her keys. The last thing she remembered from the night before was Richard sitting at the kitchen table, rubbing his temples. "Mark's been acting strange, Sarah, just be careful," he had said quietly, his eyes shadowed. She had brushed it off then, telling him to get some sleep. Now those words rang in her ears like a warning siren. When she screeched to a halt near the workshop 20 minutes later, red and blue lights flickered against the dawn sky. The shop, Richard's second home for 40 years, was engulfed in flames, the roof sagging like a broken spine. The acrid smell of burning cedar and varnish hit her throat, making her cough. She tried to run forward, but a firefighter in heavy gear held out an arm. "Ma'am, you can't go in there." Over his shoulder, she spotted Mark and Emily standing near a police car. Mark's hair was perfectly in place despite the chaos, his hands shoved deep in his coat pockets. Emily clutched a paper cup of coffee, eyes wide but dry. How did you get here before me?" Sarah gasped, pushing past another officer. Mark stepped forward quickly, slipping an arm around her shoulders. "Mom, don't look." "It's horrible. The roof collapsed. Dad." His voice trailed off as if he couldn't bear to say more, but his grip on her arm was firm, guiding her away from the view. "I need to see him," she cried, struggling. "Let me see my husband. They're bringing what they found out now," Emily murmured, her tone rehearsed. A gurney emerged from the smoke, 2 paramedics wheeling a blackened, covered form. Sarah's knees buckled. She reached for the sheet, but Mark blocked her hand gently but decisively. "Don't, Mom, please. It's not how you want to remember him." Somewhere behind them, an investigator muttered about faulty wiring, an accidental spark from an old extension cord. Sarah heard the words, but they floated like smoke, unreal. All she could feel was Richard's hand from the night before, warm on hers, warning her. As the sun rose over Ashland, its light weak and gray, Sarah stood frozen on the gravel lot, the smell of ash settling in her hair. Her mind whispered the last thing Richard had said. "Mark's been acting strange." "Be careful," the phrase replayed again and again until it drowned out the sirens. The sky over Evergreen Hills Cemetery was a dull pewter gray on the morning of Richard's funeral, the kind of sky that made everything look washed out and fragile. A thin mist clung to the grass, soaking the edges of Sarah's black hem as she stepped carefully between headstones. She could still smell smoke on her coat even after 2 washes, as if the fire had followed her here. Mark had insisted on handling the arrangements himself. Dad always wanted things simple and private, he had told her on the phone a few days earlier, his voice brisk, almost impatient. Now, standing near the casket, Sarah noticed how everything felt rushed. The small tent barely big enough for a handful of folding chairs, the generic wreaths leaning against the stand, the minister flipping quickly through his notes. Only 3 of Richard's old friends from the wood shop had managed to come, looking uncomfortable in their Sunday suits. Sarah had wanted to invite the entire neighborhood, the customers who had bought Richard's chairs and tables for decades, the children he had taught to sand wood in the summer. But when she'd mentioned it, Mark had shaken his head. "Dad liked privacy," he repeated, firm, as if closing a door. Emily had chimed in with a tight smile. "Don't worry, Mom. We'll take care of everything. You just grieve." Now, seated in the front row, Sarah clutched a damp tissue in one hand and a small wooden cross in the other, the last thing Richard had carved. Her voice trembled as she tried to follow the minister's prayer. "The Lord is my shepherd," she whispered, but the words caught in her throat. Behind her, she could hear the low murmur of Mark speaking to Emily about paperwork. "We need to sign the insurance release next week," he muttered, not quite low enough. Emily hushed him, glancing at Sarah, but her eyes remained dry. When the minister closed his Bible, Mark stepped forward, touching Sarah's shoulder. "You don't have to speak, Mom, just sit. We'll handle the rest." "I want to say something," she said quietly, rising on trembling legs. She faced the small crowd and began to talk about Richard, his patience with students, his smell of cedar and coffee, the way he fixed neighbors' chairs for free. As she spoke, her phone vibrated inside her purse. She hesitated, then excused herself, stepping a few feet away to glance at the screen. An unknown number from Portland. Her thumb hovered, then she answered. A whisper crackled through. "Mrs. Thompson, listen carefully." "Richard isn't dead," Sarah's breath caught. "Who is this?" she whispered, her eyes darting back toward the casket. "Don't trust the people around you," the voice said. "Especially Mark." The call ended abruptly, leaving only the sound of wind in the trees. Sarah's heart hammered so loudly she thought the mourners could hear it. She turned back toward the tent, her gaze locking on Mark. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, face composed, eyes unreadable. In that moment, the world tilted. The fire, the rushed funeral, Richard's last warning. It all swirled in her mind like smoke. She clutched her purse to her chest, a cold shiver running down her spine, and whispered to herself, "What is happening?" That night the house on Maple Avenue felt emptier than ever. Rain tapped steadily against the kitchen window as Sarah sat at the table with a cold mug of tea in front of her, staring at the pattern of wood grain where Richard used to sit. She had changed into an old gray cardigan, the sleeves pulled over her hands for warmth. Her phone lay beside the mug, silent, until it buzzed sharply and lit up with an unknown number from Medford. Her stomach tightened. She swiped to open it. Text message. "Check the old warehouse at 1205 Jackson Street, Medford." She blinked, heart thudding. Her fingers hovered over the keys before typing back, "Who are you?" The reply came almost instantly. "A friend of Richard's. Don't tell anyone." Sarah sat frozen. The house creaked as if it were listening. She glanced toward the hallway where Mark's last bouquet of sympathy flowers sat wilting in a vase. Richard's voice echoed in her mind from that last evening. "Mark's been acting strange, Sarah. Be careful." She stood, almost knocking over the tea, and grabbed her car keys. "I'm losing my mind," she whispered, but she still shrugged on her raincoat and stuffed the phone in her pocket. Her heart raced as she slipped out the back door, careful not to wake the neighbors. The drive to Medford took 30 minutes but felt like an hour. The wipers swished rhythmically, blurring the streetlights into streaks of gold. At every red light she thought of turning back, but something stronger pulled her forward. She whispered to herself, "If there's even a chance." Jackson Street was a row of shuttered warehouses and chain-link fences, puddles shining under weak lamps. She parked 2 blocks away, killed the engine, and sat for a moment gripping the wheel. Then she stepped out into the rain. The warehouse at 1205 loomed in the darkness, its sign faded, windows broken. The metal door groaned as she pushed it open. Inside smelled of damp wood and oil. She clicked on her phone's flashlight, the narrow beam cutting across dusty crates and old pallets. Her footsteps echoed. "Hello?" She called softly, voice trembling. "Is anyone here?" No answer. Only the drip of water somewhere in the back. Then her light caught on something small in the corner. A familiar blue baseball cap, stained with sawdust. Richard's cap. Her breath caught. She crouched, fingers brushing the brim. Beneath it lay a scrap of paper folded twice. With shaking hands she unfolded it. The handwriting was rough, hurried, but undeniably Richard's. "Sarah, I've been deceived. Don't trust Mark." She sank to her knees on the cold concrete, the words swimming before her eyes. For a moment she couldn't breathe. Her world tilted. Grief, confusion, a flicker of hope and terror all at once. "Oh, Richard," she whispered, clutching the note to her chest as if it might bring him back. Rain drummed on the tin roof above, a lonely sound that seemed to echo her racing heart. The morning after her trip to the warehouse, Sarah woke before dawn, her mind still echoing with Richard's scrawled warning. "Don't trust Mark." She had barely slept, pacing the hallway with the note in her hand. The smell of coffee brewing in the kitchen pulled her from her thoughts. She slipped on a dark cardigan and went downstairs. Mark was already at the table, sleeves rolled neatly up on his expensive shirt, a leather briefcase open beside him. The soft clink of porcelain cups filled the small kitchen. Emily stood at the counter, pouring coffee into 3 mugs as if it were a normal Sunday morning. "Morning, Mom," Mark said brightly, his voice rehearsed. "We've got something important to go over." He slid a folder across the table toward her. "Dad took out a new life insurance policy 6 months ago. $200,000. We need your signature to claim it." Sarah sat down slowly, her fingers brushing the cool leather of the folder but not opening it, her eyes fixed on Mark's face. "How do you know all these details?" she asked quietly. "Your father never mentioned this policy to me." Mark's smile didn't reach his eyes. He shrugged. "I handle things now, Mom. I just want to make sure you're taken care of." Emily turned, her hair perfectly arranged, and set a steaming mug in front of Sarah. "You must be exhausted after the funeral. Drink this, it'll help," she said softly. Sarah glanced at the cup, the dark liquid swirling. Her stomach tightened. She pushed it gently back across the table. "I already had some upstairs," she murmured, a flicker of something, irritation, passed over Mark's face before he composed himself. "Mom," he said, leaning forward, "we're only trying to help. Dad's gone. You shouldn't have to handle all this paperwork alone." Sarah looked at his manicured hands resting on the folder, at Emily's practiced smile. Her mind flashed to the blue cap at the warehouse, the damp note in her purse. "Don't trust Mark." The kitchen suddenly felt smaller, the smell of coffee heavy in the air. "I appreciate your concern," she said, voice steady though her hands trembled under the table. "But I'm not signing anything until I understand every detail." Mark laughed lightly, but there was a sharp edge to it. "Of course, take your time," he said, closing the folder with a snap. "We just thought we'd make things easier for you." Emily gathered the mugs, glancing at her husband, then back at Sarah. "We'll come back later," she said gently, as if speaking to a child. As they rose to leave, Sarah remained seated, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. She kept her face calm, but inside a wildfire of suspicion burned. The note in her purse felt like a stone against her hip, anchoring her resolve. She whispered under her breath after the door closed, "Richard, I won't let them trick me." 2 days after the tense breakfast with Mark, Sarah stood at the bottom of the worn stone steps leading into the Ashland Police Department. The building smelled faintly of wet paper and coffee. A bulletin board inside displayed lost dog flyers and neighborhood watch notices. She clutched her purse tightly, the folded note from the warehouse hidden inside, and tried to steady her breathing. This was not something she had ever imagined doing, walking into a police station to talk about her own son. At the front desk, a young officer with freckles looked up. "Can I help you, ma'am? I'd like to speak with Sergeant Paul Anderson, please," Sarah said, her voice softer than she intended. Minutes later, she was ushered into a small office lined with metal filing cabinets. Paul Anderson was in his 50s, a tall man with tired eyes and a wedding ring that caught the light as he shook her hand. He gestured for her to sit. "Mrs. Thompson, what can I do for you?" Sarah perched on the edge of the chair, twisting her tissue. "It's about my husband's death," she began, then told him, haltingly at first, then faster, about the fire, the anonymous texts, the note in the warehouse, Mark's pressure over the insurance. As she spoke, Paul leaned back, steepling his fingers, listening intently. When she finished, silence settled over the office. Paul finally exhaled. "That's a lot to take in," he said quietly. "I understand why you're worried, but what you've told me, it's mostly suspicion. For an investigation, we'll need concrete evidence." Sarah's shoulders slumped. "I knew you'd say that." He leaned forward, voice low but firm. "I'm not dismissing you. I've seen families torn apart by money before. You need to be careful, Mrs. Thompson. If you truly believe someone means you harm, don't confront them directly. Document everything. Record conversations if you can." She nodded slowly. "Record conversations? It's legal in Oregon if one party consents. Use your phone. Dates, times, what's said. Don't let them know you're doing it," Paul advised, sliding his business card across the desk. "And call me if things escalate." Sarah tucked the card into her purse like a lifeline. As she left the station, the rain had stopped, but the air still smelled of smoke. She pulled out her phone and opened the recording app, her thumb hesitating before pressing "New Recording." That evening, she dialed Lily in Seattle, hoping for some comfort. "Honey," she began gently, "have you noticed anything strange about your brother lately? The insurance, the fire..." There was a long pause on the line. Finally, Lily spoke, her voice tight. "Mom, don't get involved. I'm busy, please." "Lily, I'm scared," Sarah whispered. "Your father warned me. I have to go." Lily cut in, and the call ended with a click. Sarah sat in the darkened kitchen, phone still in her hand, the quiet hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. She felt the weight of isolation pressing down, but beneath it a small, steady spark of determination flickered. She would not be silent. She would gather proof. Sunday morning broke gray and cool over Maple Avenue, the kind of morning when the neighborhood was still, and the only sound was the caw of crows in the pines. Sarah sat at her kitchen table in her robe, staring at the blank notepad where she had begun listing everything Sergeant Anderson had told her. Document. Record. Don't eat anything they give you. The note trembled slightly under her pen. A knock at the door startled her. She glanced at the clock, 8:15. Through the lace curtain, she saw Mark's SUV glinting at the curb. She swallowed hard, smoothing her hair before opening the door. "Morning, Mom," Mark said brightly, stepping inside with a paper bag from Rise and Shine Bakery in Medford. The buttery smell of fresh croissants filled the kitchen, a scent that once would have made her smile. "I thought you could use a treat. You're losing weight." Emily followed, balancing a cardboard tray with 2 steaming cups of coffee. Her smile was thin, her eyes scanning the kitchen. "It's your favorite latte, Mrs. Thompson," she said softly, setting a cup at Sarah's place at the table. Sarah's stomach clenched. Paul's voice echoed in her head. "Don't eat or drink anything they bring." She forced a polite smile. "That's thoughtful of you both, but I already had breakfast," she said, pulling her robe tighter. Mark's brow furrowed, a flash of irritation crossing his face. "You're not even going to try one?" he asked, pulling out a golden croissant and tearing it in half so the flaky crumbs scattered onto the table. "They're still warm." She shook her head gently, folding her hands. "Thank you, sweetheart. I'm just tired." He stared at her for a moment, then set the pastry back into the bag. "Mom," he said slowly, "you don't trust me anymore, do you?" Sarah kept her voice calm, light. "I'm grieving, Mark, that's all." She reached over to touch his hand, but he pulled it back, wiping crumbs from his sleeve. Emily busied herself at the counter, but Sarah caught the quick glance she shot Mark, a silent conversation passing between them. "Of course you're grieving," Mark said after a pause, his smile returning but brittle now. "We're just trying to help." While they spoke, Sarah quietly slipped a small zip-top bag from her purse under the table. She broke off a piece of croissant with her fingertips and, pretending to adjust her napkin, slid it inside. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure they could hear. Emily pushed the coffee toward her again. "At least take a sip," she urged. Sarah covered the cup with her palm. "Really, dear, I've had enough caffeine already." For a moment, the kitchen went still except for the ticking of the wall clock. Mark leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing just slightly. Sarah felt the air grow heavier, her own breath shallow. Inside, she was trembling, but outwardly she held her faint smile. When they finally left, the kitchen smelled of butter and espresso. Sarah locked the door behind them and leaned against it, exhaling shakily. She pulled the little bag of pastry from her pocket and placed it carefully into a larger envelope, her fingers cold. "We'll see what's really in you," she whispered to the crumb of croissant, a spark of determination cutting through her fear. That afternoon, the light in the kitchen turned a dull, syrupy gold as the sun slid behind the pines. Sarah sat at the small table, sorting through unpaid bills, when the doorbell rang twice in quick succession. She rose, smoothing her sweater, and opened the door to find Mark standing there with his phone in one hand and a polite, businesslike smile on his face. "Mom, this is for your own good," he said softly, stepping inside without waiting for her answer. "Dr. Ellis is here to check on you." Behind him, a tall man in a tweed jacket appeared, holding a leather satchel. He looked about 60, with neatly trimmed gray hair and a badge clipped to his breast pocket. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm Dr. Raymond Ellis," he said, extending a hand. "Just a quick evaluation, nothing to worry about." Sarah blinked. "Evaluation for what?" "I didn't ask for a doctor." Mark guided her back toward the kitchen, his hand warm but firm on her elbow. "Mom, you've been under a lot of stress, saying strange things. We're worried. This is just to make sure you're okay." Emily was already at the table, arranging papers and 2 cups of tea as if setting the stage. She offered a sympathetic smile. "It's only because we love you, Mrs. Thompson. You've been through so much." Dr. Ellis opened a folder and began scribbling notes without even sitting down. "Symptoms of paranoia, fixation on deceased spouse," he murmured under his breath. Sarah's cheeks flushed hot. She stood straighter, gripping the back of a chair. "Excuse me," she said sharply. "You haven't asked me a single question. You can't diagnose me without an examination," Mark interrupted before the doctor could reply. "Mom," he said, lowering his voice like a teacher scolding a child. "Yesterday you told me Dad might still be alive. You accused me of plotting against you. This is exactly why we called Dr. Ellis. You need rest." Emily sighed dramatically, folding her hands. "We're not the enemy. We're trying to help." Sarah's heart pounded. She turned to Dr. Ellis, meeting his eyes. "You don't have the right to write anything in that folder until you've spoken to me," she said, her voice steady now. "I am completely lucid. I cook my own meals, pay my own bills, and I know exactly what's happening in this house." For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. Dr. Ellis shifted uncomfortably, closing the folder. Perhaps we should reschedule," he muttered. "I'll need more context." He rose, clutching his satchel like a shield. Mark's jaw tightened. "Doctor," he began, but Ellis cut him off with a polite nod. "I'll be in touch," he said quickly, heading for the door. Sarah watched him leave, her pulse still racing. In that instant, the room seemed to sharpen into focus. Mark's clenched fists, Emily's forced smile, the tea cooling untouched on the table. She realized with a jolt that this wasn't concern. It was a performance, a paper trail being built to declare her incompetent. She straightened her shoulders, a flicker of steel in her spine. Not today, she thought. Not like this. That night the streets of Medford were slick with drizzle, the kind that blurs neon lights into long, trembling streaks. Sarah pulled her old Subaru off Jackson Street and parked a block away from the warehouse at 1205 Jackson Street. She cut the engine and sat for a moment, hands gripping the steering wheel, listening to her own heartbeat. The dashboard clock read 11:42 p.m. The air smelled of wet asphalt and pine resin. She slipped on a dark raincoat and tugged the hood low, glancing over her shoulder to make sure no car had followed her. The warehouse loomed ahead. An aging brick building with rust-streaked loading doors and a faded sign that read, "Storage Units." A single light buzzed over the side entrance, casting a pale halo onto the puddled concrete. Sarah's fingers trembled as she fitted the small key she'd found in Richard's desk into the lock. The door opened with a groan, and she stepped into darkness that smelled of sawdust and old oil. She flicked on her flashlight, its narrow beam slicing through rows of stacked crates and tarpaulin-covered shapes. "Richard," she whispered before she could stop herself. The only answer was the echo of her own voice. At the back of the warehouse, near a workbench, sat an old wooden box with her husband's handwriting on a strip of masking tape, for S. She dropped to her knees, heart pounding, and pried off the lid. Inside, wrapped in a rag, was Richard's old flip phone, the battered one he'd carried for years before switching to a smartphone. She pressed the power button with a shaking thumb. Against all odds, the screen lit up with a weak glow. A notification blinked. One new voicemail. Sarah pressed play and lifted the phone to her ear. "Sarah?" The voice on the line was hoarse, frantic, unmistakably Richard's. "Sarah, if you're hearing this, I'm not dead. Mark has me locked up. I'm at the old cabin near Hyatt Lake. Don't trust anyone. Please, hurry!" The message ended with a hiss of static. Sarah's knees gave out and she sat hard on the concrete, clutching the phone to her chest. "Oh my God. Richard?" she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. For a moment she just rocked there, back and forth, her breath coming in gasps, until she forced herself to pull a small notebook from her coat pocket and scribble down the location. Hyatt Lake. Old cabin. She wiped her face with the sleeve of her coat, slid the phone back into the box and closed it carefully. Her mind raced as she retraced her steps to the car, every shadow on the street now a potential pair of watching eyes. At dawn, her phone rang, jarring her awake from a restless sleep on the couch. Mark's name flashed on the screen. She answered, trying to steady her voice. "Mom," he said lightly, almost too lightly. "You shouldn't be going out alone at night. It's dangerous. People get hurt." Sarah stared at the wall, gripping the receiver. He knew. Somehow he knew. "I'm fine," she said quietly, and hung up before he could respond. Inside, a cold certainty spread through her chest. Mark was watching her every move. The next morning, the sky over Ashland was a low ceiling of gray clouds. A light mist hung over East Main Street as Sarah's Subaru crept toward the small brick police station, tucked between a bakery and the public library. She parked at the curb, hands clenched on the steering wheel for a moment before she forced herself to move. Her pulse was a drum in her ears. She clutched the plastic evidence bag containing Richard's old phone, the one she'd found in the warehouse, and a folded sheet of paper with the handwritten words, "Hyatt Lake, Old Cabin." Inside the station, fluorescent lights buzzed softly. The scent of burnt coffee and wet coats filled the narrow lobby. Sarah walked up to the counter where a young officer in a navy blue uniform looked up from his paperwork. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked. "I need to speak with Sergeant Paul Anderson," Sarah said, her voice trembling but firm. "It's urgent." A minute later, Paul Anderson appeared from a hallway lined with bulletin boards. He was in his late 40s, broad-shouldered, with a salt and pepper beard and steady gray eyes. "Mrs. Thompson," he greeted quietly, gesturing her toward a small interview room. As soon as the door shut, Sarah set the evidence bag on the table with a soft thud. "I found this," she said, pushing it toward him. It's Richard's phone. There's a voicemail. He says he's alive. He says Mark has him at the old cabin near Hyatt Lake. Paul's brows furrowed as he picked up the bag, turning it over. He slipped on a pair of latex gloves and carefully removed the phone, scrolling through the message. After a few seconds, he hit play. Richard's frantic voice filled the small room. Paul glanced up, his expression tightening. "This is serious," he said finally, leaning back in his chair. "But we can't storm a cabin on one voicemail. We need to confirm he's there and build probable cause. Otherwise, Mark's lawyers will rip this apart." Sarah's fingers knotted in her lap. "So what do we do?" she whispered. "He's my husband. He's out there, maybe tied up or worse. And Mark, my own son." Her voice cracked. Paul's gaze softened. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I know this is hell for you, but you can help us. If Mark contacts you again or tries to move you somewhere, we can set a trap." "A trap?" she echoed, blinking back tears. He nodded. "We'll put a GPS tracker in your purse. If Mark takes you to the cabin or anywhere near it, we'll have units ready. You just have to act normal, like you believe whatever he tells you." Sarah swallowed hard. "You want me to go with him?" "If he tries to take you," Paul said gently. "Don't provoke him. Don't argue, just go. Keep your phone on. We'll be there." She stared at the small black tracker he placed on the table, no bigger than a car key. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. "What if he realizes?" "Hide it in a side pocket of your bag," Paul advised. "He won't notice. And if you feel in danger, text me a single word. Pine. That's our code." Sarah inhaled slowly, clutching her purse as if it were a lifeline. The smell of coffee and paper and old wood filled her nose. "All right," she said at last. "I'll do it. For Richard." Paul gave her a small, reassuring smile. "You're braver than you think, Mrs. Thompson." When she stepped back out into the damp morning air, the mist had turned to drizzle. She drew her coat tighter, feeling the tracker's small weight in her bag. Her heart beat wildly, but beneath the fear, a spark of determination took hold. If Mark thought she was still the frightened, obedient mother he could control, he was about to find out otherwise. Late afternoon light slanted across the worn wood floors of the living room at 417 Maple Avenue. The old grandfather clock ticked steadily in the corner, its sound suddenly louder than usual in the tense silence. Sarah sat on the edge of the sofa, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She could smell the faint aroma of lemon polish from her morning cleaning, but even that homely scent felt alien now, as if the house itself were holding its breath. The front door opened without a knock. Mark stepped in, tall and rigid in a gray suit that still carried the crispness of his Medford office. Emily followed a step behind, clutching her designer handbag, eyes flicking nervously around the room as if she were checking for hidden witnesses. Mark's polished shoes made a slow, deliberate sound on the wooden floorboards. "Mother," he said flatly, his tone stripped of warmth. "We need to settle this now." Sarah rose, smoothing the front of her cardigan. Her knees trembled. "Settle what?" she asked, though she already knew. Mark dropped a thick envelope onto the coffee table. Papers spilled out slightly, revealing legal letterheads and a bold heading, "Agreement of Sale." "The house," he said. "You sign this, we finalize everything. Tomorrow I'll take you to the rest facility in Portland. You'll be comfortable there." Emily perched on the arm of the armchair, her voice soft, rehearsed. "It's a very nice place, Mother. There's a garden and art classes. You'd like it?" Sarah stared at the papers. Her mind flicked to Sergeant Anderson's face that morning, the GPS tracker hidden in her handbag, the single code word Pine. Her heart hammered. She said quietly in Vietnamese before switching back to English. "I need a little more time." Mark's jaw tightened. He stepped closer, his cologne sharp in her nose. "No," he said, eyes locked on hers. "There's no more time. You've been stalling. Sign it now." Sarah forced herself to breathe. "I'm not stalling. I'm overwhelmed. This house has been my life." Your father is gone," Mark cut in harshly. Emily placed a hand on his arm. "Mark," she murmured, "don't upset her." "Mother, please don't make this hard for us. We're only trying to help you." Sarah's lips curved into a faint, sad smile. She could feel the sweat at the base of her neck. "All right," she said softly, reaching for the pen but not picking it up. "Tomorrow. I'll sign tomorrow. Just give me one night to say goodbye to this house." Mark hesitated. His eyes searched her face for a flicker of defiance. Finally, he straightened. "Fine," he said at last. "Tomorrow, 10 a.m. He gathered the papers back into the envelope with a sharp snap. "Don't make me regret this." Emily rose, giving Sarah a quick, almost guilty glance. "Try to rest, Mother," she said. "It's for the best." When the door closed behind them, Sarah let out a trembling exhale and sagged back against the sofa. Her fingers brushed the side pocket of her handbag, feeling the small tracker hidden there. Tomorrow, she thought, staring at the darkened window where the evening sky pressed close. Tomorrow everything will be decided. The next morning dawned pale and brittle over Ashland, a thin frost glazing the lawns of Maple Avenue. Sarah stood by the window, coat already on, her small purse clutched to her chest. Inside, hidden beneath a folded handkerchief, lay the GPS tracker Sergeant Anderson had given her. She whispered to herself, "Steady, Sarah. Just steady," before hearing the low rumble of Mark's SUV pulling into the driveway. He honked once. "Let's go, Mother." His voice called through the open window, falsely cheerful. She locked the front door with deliberate slowness, feeling the brass key turn beneath her trembling fingers. Mark stood by the driver's side, sunglasses hiding his eyes though the sky was overcast. Emily waited in the back seat, scrolling quickly on her phone, thumbs tapping in bursts. Sarah slid into the passenger seat, her palms cold against the vinyl. "Where are we going exactly?" she asked softly as Mark shifted the SUV into gear. "You'll see," Mark replied, eyes fixed on the road ahead. "It's time you saw where you'll be staying. Fresh mountain air will do you good." Emily leaned forward, voice honeyed but tight. "It's beautiful up there, Mother. So peaceful." Sarah nodded, staring out at the passing scenery of familiar houses giving way to pine trees and rocky hillsides. She pressed her hand over her purse, feeling the slight lump of the tracker, like a heartbeat. Somewhere back along the highway, she knew, unmarked police cars were keeping a careful distance. The asphalt turned to gravel, the car jolting as it climbed higher into the foothills. Sarah's eyes flicked to the dashboard clock, 9:42 a.m., and then to the mirror, where she thought she saw a flash of a blue sedan before it vanished around a bend. She inhaled sharply. "You all right?" Mark asked, glancing at her briefly. "Just carsick," she murmured, swallowing hard. Her pulse thudded in her ears. Another 15 minutes and the road narrowed to a dirt path lined with tall firs. Snow still clung to the shaded ground. A weather-beaten wooden sign appeared at a fork in the trail. Hyatt Lake Trail, private access. The paint was peeling, the wood warped from decades of storms. Sarah's breath caught. Richard had taken her here once, years ago, pointing out wildflowers along the trail. "Why here?" she asked, unable to keep the tremor from her voice. Mark smiled tightly. "You'll understand soon enough." Emily put her phone away at last, her eyes darting between Mark and Sarah. "Almost there," she said softly, as though to herself. Sarah's fingers dug into the seat. She pictured Sergeant Anderson leaning over a radio, tracking the little blip of her purse on a screen. "Please be close. Please be ready," she prayed silently. The SUV bumped over a rut and the trees opened into a clearing. Ahead stood a cabin of weathered logs, its roof sagging under patches of moss, shutters half broken, a relic from another time. A rusty mailbox leaned near the porch. Sarah's stomach flipped. This was Richard's old cabin. She forced a small, wavering smile. "It's remote," she whispered. "Exactly," Mark said, putting the car into park. "No distractions." Sarah's heart was hammering so hard she thought they might hear it. She gripped her purse like a lifeline, feeling the tiny device inside, and prayed the officers were close enough to see the cabin too. The SUV crunched to a stop on the gravel clearing. The pines swayed in a cold wind, their scent sharp and resinous. The only sound the distant call of a hawk. Mark cut the engine. For a heartbeat, everything was still, except for the pounding in Sarah's chest. She could taste metal on her tongue. Emily shifted in the back seat, snapping her purse shut with a soft click. "Come on, Mother," Mark said, voice low, almost a growl. He stepped out, the door closing with a heavy thud. Sarah's fingers gripped her handbag. She felt the tracker inside like a small hidden heartbeat. When Mark opened her door, his expression was unreadable behind his sunglasses. "Where are we?" she asked, though she knew. "Your new home," he replied, the sarcasm curling around each word. The cabin loomed ahead, logs weathered to gray, porch steps sagging, the door slightly ajar. Sarah hesitated, boots crunching on patches of old snow as Mark guided her forward with a firm hand at her elbow. Emily trailed behind, her face pale, eyes darting between them. Inside, the air was damp and smelled of mildew and cold ash. Dust motes floated in the dim light that slanted through torn curtains. At first, Sarah saw only the rough-hewn furniture, the sagging couch, and the iron stove. Then her eyes adjusted, and her breath caught in her throat. "Richard?" she whispered. In the far corner of the cabin, her husband sat tied to a wooden chair with thick rope, wrists raw and red. His face was gaunt, a dark bruise blossoming along his jaw, but his eyes, those kind, steady eyes, lit up when he saw her. "Sarah," he rasped, voice hoarse but alive. "Oh God, Sarah." Her knees nearly gave way. She lurched forward, but Mark's arm shot out, blocking her. "Stay back," he snapped. "We're not done yet. What have you done?" she cried, tears blurring her vision. "Mark, this is your father." Mark's face twisted with something like rage and despair. He stopped listening. "He stood in the way. We gave him chances." He pulled a folder from his coat and flung it onto the table. "Sign the deed now. Sell the house. Transfer everything. Or he dies for real." Emily's hands trembled as she reached into her bag and produced a slim hunting knife, the blade catching the thin light. Her voice shook. "Please, just do what he says, Mother. We can all walk away." Sarah's heart felt like it was cracking open. She took a step toward Richard, voice breaking. "You're my son," she whispered. "How can you do this?" Mark's jaw clenched. "There's no way back now," he said, shoving a pen toward her. "Sign it." Outside, a sound rose faintly over the pines, a rhythmic thumping, at first like the wind, then unmistakable. Sarah's head snapped toward the window. Over the treetops, she saw a dark shape moving closer, the flash of rotors catching the sun. Mark heard it too. His eyes narrowed. "What is that?" he hissed. Sarah felt a surge of wild hope. She gripped her purse, feeling the tracker inside. The sound of the helicopter grew louder, rattling the cabin's loose panes. "It's over, Mark," she whispered under her breath, tears streaming down her cheeks. "It's finally over." Richard struggled against his bonds, his voice hoarse but urgent. "Sarah, stay back." The old cabin filled with the roar of blades, dust swirling from the floor. Mark spun toward the door, panic flickering across his face for the first time. Emily's knife trembled in her hand, and Sarah, standing between her husband and her son, realized the moment of reckoning had arrived. The roar of the helicopter above shook the loose shutters and sent dust spiraling off the cabin's rafters. Sarah's heart pounded in her ears. Mark spun toward the window, face pale. Emily's knife wavered in her trembling hand. Richard coughed, struggling against the ropes that bound him. Then, with a thunderous crack, the door to the cabin burst inward. Splinters of wood flew as a wave of dark uniformed figures stormed inside, weapons raised. "Ashland police! Drop the weapon now!" Sergeant Paul Anderson's voice boomed, echoing off the log walls. The scene exploded into chaos. Emily screamed, the knife clattering to the dusty floorboards as she covered her head. Mark bolted toward the back door, but two officers were already there, their boots pounding against the floor. "Get down!" one barked. Mark twisted, tried to shove past, but a swift tackle sent him sprawling onto the floor. The sound of handcuffs snapping shut cut through the cabin like a verdict. "Sarah, get back," Paul commanded, moving to shield her with one arm. She staggered to the side, still clutching her purse, eyes wide and streaming with tears. Richard sagged in his chair, ropes digging into his bruised wrists. "Sarah," he rasped, his voice breaking. "It's okay, honey, it's okay," she whispered, stumbling toward him as two medics in tactical vests moved in behind her. They crouched by Richard, checking his pulse, one already speaking urgently into a radio for the waiting ambulance down the road. Clear on the left, another officer called. Boots scuffed across the plank floor. One by one, the threats were neutralized. Emily knelt with her hands on her head, sobbing. Mark cursed under his breath as the cuffs bit into his wrists. "You don't understand," he shouted hoarsely, but the officers paid him no mind. Paul crouched next to Richard and Sarah. "He's alive," he said firmly, looking Sarah in the eye. "We've called for paramedics. They're coming up the trail now." Sarah's knees gave way. She knelt on the floor beside her husband, her hand trembling as she brushed a strand of hair off his sweat-streaked forehead. "Thank you, God. Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracked but full of relief. Richard managed a faint smile, eyes glistening. "You found me," he murmured. "I never stopped looking," she whispered back, tears falling onto his sleeve. Paul rose, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder. "Mrs. Thompson, you're safe now. We have them both in custody. You did everything right." Sarah looked over her shoulder. Mark stood between two officers, head bowed, lips pressed tight. No longer the polished businessman, but a frightened man caught in his own trap. Emily sniffled softly, mascara streaking her cheeks. Outside, the thrum of the helicopter faded as the team signaled secure. Sunlight spilled through the open doorway, glinting off the patches of snow outside. For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt the weight begin to lift from her chest. She squeezed Richard's hand and closed her eyes. "It's over," she breathed. "We're going home." The cabin smelled of pine and gun oil and freedom. The interview room at the Medford Police Department smelled faintly of old coffee and disinfectant. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a pale glow on the gray walls and the metal table bolted to the floor. Sarah sat just outside in a plastic chair by the hallway, hands folded tightly in her lap. Through the half-open door, she could hear Mark's voice rising and falling, sometimes smooth and calculated, sometimes sharp and defensive. Inside, Detective Reyes clicked a pen, his expression unreadable as he leaned forward. "Mr. Thompson," he said evenly, "we have your phone records, the insurance papers, the tracker data, the voicemail from your father, and the toxicology report on the croissants. Are you sure you want to stick to your story?" Mark exhaled hard, shoulders stiff. "I was protecting my mother," he insisted, his eyes darting between Reyes and Sergeant Anderson, who stood by the wall. "She's been delusional since Dad died. She thought he was alive, accused me of poisoning him. I was trying to get her help, that's all." Reyes slid a clear evidence bag across the table. Inside lay the last croissant Sarah had secretly saved, now labeled and sealed. "This," he said quietly, "came back positive for benzodiazepines, strong sedatives, enough to knock someone unconscious." Mark's mouth opened, closed again. "That's not mine," he muttered. Emily sat at the far end of the table, mascara smudged beneath her eyes, her designer coat wrinkled from hours in custody. She clutched a tissue in one hand, twisting it until it tore. "Mark," she whispered. "They know everything." "Emily, be quiet," Mark snapped without looking at her. Reyes turned to her gently. "Mrs. Thompson, you're not under arrest for murder, but you need to tell us the truth if you want any leniency." Emily's shoulders began to shake. "I didn't want this," she said, tears spilling. "He told me it was just paperwork. Then it was Dad in the cabin and I was in too deep. We're drowning in debt. I thought, if we could get the insurance money..." She broke off, covering her face. In the hallway, Sarah pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. She could hear every word, each confession striking like a hammer. Part of her wanted to run into the room, to shout at them, to ask how her own child could have planned such cruelty. Another part simply felt hollow, as if the years of family dinners and birthday cakes had been a dream. Sergeant Anderson stepped out for a moment and crouched beside her. "Mrs. Thompson," he said softly, "we're processing charges now. Attempted murder, kidnapping, insurance fraud, falsifying medical records. Your testimony and the evidence you collected have been crucial. You've saved your husband's life." Sarah nodded weakly, gripping the edge of the chair. I never thought it would come to this," she whispered. Anderson gave her a moment, then rose and walked back in. Through the window, she could see Mark slump forward, his face in his hands. Emily stared at the table, lips moving in silent prayer. A nurse from Rogue Valley Medical Center called to update her. Richard was stable, receiving fluids and care, expected to recover with time. Sarah closed her eyes, relief mingling with grief. The sound of Mark's muffled voice inside the room, "I was just trying to protect the family," felt almost absurd now. She wiped her tears and straightened her back. It wasn't victory exactly, but a kind of truth she could hold on to. Outside, through the narrow window at the end of the corridor, the Oregon sky was clearing after days of rain. Sunlight broke across the parking lot, glinting on police cruisers. For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt she could breathe without fear. The courthouse of Jackson County rose like a pale sandstone fortress against the October sky. Its columns streaked with rain from the night before. Maple leaves swirled across the steps as Sarah and Richard climbed them slowly, hand in hand. A chill wind tugged at Sarah's scarf, but she barely felt it. Her heart was thudding louder than the rustle of reporters setting up their cameras along the sidewalk. It had been exactly 1 month since the raid at the cabin. In that month, Richard had endured surgeries and physical therapy at Rogue Valley Medical Center, learning to move his bruised arms again. Sarah had sat by his bed every day, sometimes reading aloud from old letters, sometimes just holding his hand. Now, they were both here, standing together in the echoing foyer of the courthouse, ready to face the people who had tried to destroy them. Inside, the air smelled faintly of varnished wood and old paper. Courtroom 3A was crowded, local journalists with notepads, curious residents of Medford and Ashland, a few lawyers flipping through thick files. On the front page of the Ashland Daily News, a headline lay folded on a bench: "Family Betrayal, Thompson Conspiracy Uncovered." Sarah and Richard took their seats in the first row behind the prosecution table. Richard wore a dark suit that hung a little looser on his thinner frame. His right hand trembled slightly, but he squeezed Sarah's fingers firmly. "We're here," he murmured, eyes fixed on the bench. "We made it," she turned to him, eyes bright with tears. "We're still together," she whispered. "That's what matters." At 10 o'clock sharp, the bailiff called, "All rise." Everyone stood as Judge Carla Whitman entered, her black robe swishing as she took her seat. The gavel fell with a sharp crack. Mark was led in first, hands shackled, jaw clenched. Gone was the polished businessman from Medford. His hair was unkempt, his suit replaced by a county-issue jumpsuit. Emily followed, her face pale, mascara gone, hands twisting in her lap as she avoided Sarah's gaze. The district attorney began outlining the charges: attempted murder in the first degree, kidnapping, insurance fraud, falsifying medical records. As each charge was read, Sarah felt a mixture of sorrow and grim resolve. The words "your son" echoed in her mind, but she kept her chin high, her hand on Richard's knee. A reporter's camera clicked softly. In the back, someone whispered, "Can you believe this happened here?" When the prosecutor played the recordings, Richard's hoarse voicemail, Mark's instructions to Emily, the toxicology report on the croissants, the courtroom murmured. Emily buried her face in her hands, shoulders shaking. Mark stared at the table, lips pressed thin. During a recess, Richard leaned toward Sarah. "We've lost so much," he said quietly. "But we still have each other." She smiled through tears. "Yes," she answered. "We still have each other." When the hearing adjourned for the day, they stepped back into the crisp autumn sunlight on Main Street. Reporters called questions. Sarah ignored them, focusing only on the warmth of Richard's arm under her hand. The breeze carried the scent of roasted coffee from a cafe across the street. She drew in a deep breath. For the first time in months, it didn't feel like panic. It felt like a beginning. They walked slowly toward their car, leaves crunching underfoot, neither speaking. Behind them the courthouse loomed, but ahead, the town spread out under a brightening sky. A painful chapter was closing, but a new dawn had begun. A dawn where they were free, together, and still standing. As Sarah and Richard walked away from the courthouse that crisp autumn afternoon, the courthouse clock chimed noon, its echoes mingling with the rustle of leaves on Main Street. They moved slowly, not because of Richard's weakened body, but because each step felt like a release, every footfall carrying them farther from the nightmare that had consumed their lives. The sidewalk smelled of coffee and wet stone. Cars rolled past, ordinary life continuing as though nothing extraordinary had happened. They reached the small public square where a fountain splashed quietly. Richard sat down on a bench, pulling Sarah gently beside him. He looked older, thinner, but his eyes had the steady warmth she had feared lost. "We're free," he said softly. Sarah squeezed his hand, tears glinting in her lashes. "We're free," she repeated. And for the first time in months she believed it. Around them, people bustled with grocery bags. Children chased pigeons. Simple scenes of life that reminded Sarah how precious ordinary moments are. She thought of Mark and Emily, now awaiting trial, of the years of family dinners, of birthdays and Christmas mornings. Betrayal had scarred her, but it had not destroyed her capacity for compassion. "We'll heal," she whispered. Richard nodded, his thumb brushing the back of her hand. This story has been long, painful and real in its emotions, but it also carries a message. Even in the deepest betrayal, truth and courage can lead to justice. Families can fracture, yet human resilience can rebuild a life from ashes. When you see the warning signs of manipulation or abuse, speak out, reach for help. Someone will listen. And hold tightly to the people who prove their love through actions, not just words. If this story moved you, please support our channel so more stories like this can be told. Click like to let us know you're here, share this video with someone who needs hope, and subscribe so you never miss the next chapter. And if you're listening right now, leave a comment saying, "I'm listening," so we can stay connected and keep sharing these journeys together. See you in the next video.